Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today we're going to be talking about autogynephilia. So, I found this Reddit thread the other day on Ask Transgender, and this type of thread is extremely common. So, you'll see a thread like this basically like either every day or once a week or something. It's extremely common, but the subject line here is whenever I masturbate, my trans thoughts go away. So, this person has lots of thoughts about being trans. They think about it, they get euphoria. And then, for quote unquote, whatever reasons, that leads them to masturbate. And then they do it a lot. Then, whenever they masturbate, all their trans go away. And then it leads them back to the feeling of it's just a fetish. Okay. So, that's pretty common. That's just like classic textbook AGP. Um, for those that don't know, AGP or autogynephilia is the phenomenon whereby where a male gets sexually aroused by the thought of themselves as a woman, which can take on various different aspects. Sometimes it's about the cross dressing, other times it's about behavioral. Imagining yourself in the submissive sexual role with like a man, even if you're more or less into women. Forced feminization. It can also has aspects of physiological or anatomic fantasy, like imagining yourself with a vagina. um so the comments here are pretty typical. So they're basically trying to explain it all away, saying it's normal, and most trans women relate to this, very common. And then classic Reddit, they're going to be linking to these essays. So on pretty much every one of these Reddit threads, you will always see these same links being posted, these same essays, the same responses. This is like standard. This is like very common. They always link to these exact same essays. Okay, so what are the essays? One, it's just a fetish, right? And then the other one is this other one, which I'll be looking into, and then the other one is this gender dysphoria Bible. So let's first look at the gender dysphoria Bible. So this is like a very common resource in the trans community. It gets shared all the time. For what I can tell, it's deemed to be a sort of quote unquote authoritative source in the trans community, particularly trans feminine community. And they have a whole section in the Am I Trans page called Consider That It's Rarely Just a Fetish. I cannot tell you how many people, including me, began exploring their gender feelings in the realm of sexual fantasy. Makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Sex is one of the few realms of human experience where it's safe to explore gender without having to face larger questions about identity. You're just a man who occasionally likes to fantasize about being turned into a woman. That doesn't mean you're trans. This issue is further complicated by the term autogynephilia, a quote unquote bogus transphobic theory posited by a crank psychologist named Ray Blanchard. Autogynephilia posits that many people who self-identify as trans women aren't actually women at all, but are instead creepy men who are turned on by the idea of being a woman or having a vagina. Well, that's not really what the theory says. It's saying autogynephilia says that you're creepy men. No, it's really more about like that this is a male phenomenon. It's saying that you are male. And the other thing is like the theory is about positing a typology, because there are two types of trans women. There are the classic transsexuals who are gender nonconforming from a young age and exclusively attracted to men. The trans women who are exclusively attracted to men don't have this question of like, is it just a fetish? The question of is it just a fetish only arises in trans women who are asexual, bisexual, or exclusively attracted to women. So that is the theory. So like, it's not about saying you're creepy men. It's about noticing the very real empirical phenomenon that there are two types of trans women. And the trans women who are exclusively attracted to men and have always been exclusively attracted to men, they don't have this thing about like, oh, is it just a fetish or not? The only trans women who are concerned about whether it's just a fetish, typically, relative to their birth sex, are heterosexual or bisexual or asexual. So, and this is why the theory is about autogynephilia is a form of inverted heterosexuality. It is taking the typical male attraction to femininity, to women, gynephilia, and then inverting that, which is why you only see this pattern in gynephilic trans women. That is the theory. So, this is sort of like, okay. And so, according to Blanchard, their entire transition is just an elaborate fetish game that they're forcing the world to participate in. I mean, that's like hyperbolic. I mean, that's not really what he says. Saying it's an elaborate fetish game. No, he's just saying that like there are erotic roots to the development of gender dysphoria. Like he's not saying it's merely a fetish game. He's saying that of the types of trans women, the ones who are exclusively attracted to men don't have this fetishistic aspect, and the ones who are attracted to women or bisexual or asexual, they do have this sexual component, and that is a very real phenomenon that has been observed many times. And the posited theory is that autogynephilia is a sort of like form of heterosexuality that's been inverted to apply to the self, which is where all this comes from. And that can develop an intensity such that you go on to eventually transition, or you develop these strong, intense feelings that cause you to want to take on the trans identity and to transition. Okay, so AGP is bullshit. It's been discredited. No, it hasn't. Entire point of this theory, as far as I can tell, was to try and get cis people to start viewing trans women as male sex predators. No, it's not like Ray Blanchard never said that trans women AGP like are sex predators. He just said there is a element of sexuality to the phenomenon of heterosexual, bisexual, and asexual trans women exploring their gender identity and the subsequent developments of gender dysphoria, which is exactly what this like thing is acknowledging. Like he's saying, or they're saying, I cannot tell you how many trans people, including me, began exploring their gender in the realms of sexual fantasy. That is what Ray Blanchard was saying. Like Blanchard wasn't saying, "Oh, you must be a predator." He's just saying that like these feelings have their roots in the erotic, and saying something has its roots in the erotic also isn't saying that like fully explains the entirety of the phenomenon. Um, okay, so let's go to this other essay here. This one is very commonly linked in all these Reddit threads. Okay, so let's see. Over the years, I've counseled a lot of trans folks as they're figuring themselves out. A lot, several hundred by now. The overwhelming majority of that number have been trans feminine, but a fairly good amount have been trans masculine too. And if there's one single thing that I can count on to come up almost without fail, it's sex and kink. So sometimes it comes early in the conversation, sometimes much later, but there's almost always a question, is it just a fetish? So this person is acknowledging that in the trans feminine community, almost every single trans feminine person that they're talking to has this concern about it being a fetish. Well, that is exactly what Ray Blanchard was noticing when he came up with the theory of autogynephilia. He was basically noticing that when you look at the feminine, transsexual population that is coming into the gender clinic seeking care, there's kind of two types. There's the type who are exclusively attracted to men, and then everyone else. And in the population of everyone else, like everyone who is not exclusively attracted to men, it often has its roots in the erotic. It has its roots in the sexual. And this is exactly this article is confirming this because it's saying that pretty much every trans feminine person has this question of, is it just a fetish? Well, that's because like the fetishistic aspect, the paraphilic aspect, the sexual aspect, that is where it all starts. That is the start. That is the causal origins of this phenomenon. Doesn't mean it explains the entirety of the phenomenon. It just means that this is where it comes from. Because remember, auto, au- autogynephilia is part of an etiological theory. So, what is etiology? Etiology is about explaining the origins or something, like where something comes from, what is causing something to happen. And autogynephilia says that for the population of trans women who are not exclusively attracted to men, all the gender dysphoria, all the trans identification, all the desires, for hormones and surgeries and, transition itself, that has its causal origins in a sexual phenomenon. That's all it says. And this article does nothing to refute that because it's basically saying every single trans feminine person has this question of, is it just a fetish? Why do they have that question? Because the phenomenon starts first manifesting itself via a sexual question. Okay, so let's get into it. So they're saying how kink functions. So this whole thing they're saying is basically, fetishes are really common, kinks are really common, and then the crucial thing is that all kinks, come from some need that isn't sexual. So non-sexual needs get sublimated into sex, into kink. So it's incredibly common to have kink. But basically, the kinks are an expression of some sort of non-sexual need. Okay, so now we're going to talk about autogynephilia again. So I'm talking about autogynephilia, which is an extremely discredited and misogynistic junk theory. Notice they like always have to go over and above and saying, oh, it's been discredited, it's junk, it's transphobic, it's misogynistic. They like very rarely talk about like the merits of like the theory itself, rarely talk about the data. They just sort of say like, oh, Ray Blanchard was transphobic, Ray Blanchard was a misogynist, Ray Blanchard was a terrible person. They sort of impugn the motives of the researchers as opposed to talking about the merits of the theory itself. So Blanchard, the fellow who proposed AGP, argued that many or most trans feminine people were simply fetishists. Well, saying they're simply fetishists, no, that's not quite true. Like, he wasn't saying they're just fetishists. He said that uh the for many trans women, there's transsexuality has its origins in a paraphilia, but that doesn't mean that it is simply a paraphilia because it's a very complex phenomenon and it evolves and elaborates itself in many ways. And like, he wasn't saying it's only or simply or just a fetish or a kink. He's just saying that that is the causal origin of where this comes from for the trans women who are not exclusively attracted to men. So even if we were to accept his theory as 100% true, it has fallen to pieces because, among other things, over 93% of all cis women would qualify as being autogynephiles. So if you click on this, that goes to this paper here by Charles Moser. This is a very commonly cited study that supposedly disproves autogynephilia because the claim is that autogynephilia is also seen in females. So let's see. Autogynephilia has been described as sexual interest in some male to female transsexuals. The term has not been applied to natal women. To test the possibility that natal women also experience autogynephilia, an autogynephilia scale for women was created from items used to categorize M to Fs as autogynephilic in other studies. A questionnaire that included the autogynephilia scale for women was distributed to a sample of 51 professional women employed at an urban hospital. 29 completed questionnaires returned for analysis. So they're basing the entire debunking of the theory based on a questionnaire of 29 females. And then they're saying this somehow disproves autogynephilia. By the common definition of ever having erotic arousal to the thought or image of oneself as a woman, 93% of the respondents would be classified as autogynephilic. Okay, let's actually look at the questionnaire because, okay, so this is the questions that they asked. So, I have been erotically aroused by contemplating myself in the nude. I have been erotically aroused by contemplating myself wearing lingerie, underwear, or foundation garments. I have been erotically aroused by contemplating myself fully clothed in sexual attire. I have been erotically aroused by preparing, shaving my legs for a romantic evening or when hoping to meet a sex partner. So this is sort of illustrating like the difference between male and female because the like when a female is answering these questions, like this questionnaire does not disambiguate between having these sorts of thoughts when you're preparing for sex, which is kind of different than, just doing it like, around the house or when you're masturbating. Because if you actually look at the answers to the scale, you see that I have dressed in lingerie, sexually attire, or prepared myself before masturbating. 19 say never, on occasion say 10, and 0 say frequently or no data. So, but this is what AGPs do is like every time they masturbate, without fail, they can only masturbate by dressing up and all this stuff. And it's also, you know, when females are doing this, it's usually in preparation for like a date. They are imagining themselves getting ready for a date. Like the arousal aspect is connected to the thought of being sexy for someone else. It is relative to someone else. It is preparation for the date. So for example, the one question that has the most frequently, it's when hoping to meet for a sex partner. Like all these questions, like it is connected to someone else. It is about normal heterosexuality, but with AGP, it's very auto. It's internal. It doesn't have to do with preparing for an actual date with an actual sex partner. Um, I've been erotically aroused by contemplating myself in the nude. So yeah, like, that is not the same as AGP. Um, let's see. I've been erotically aroused by imagining myself with a sexual body. I've been erotically aroused by imagining that others find me particularly sexy. Yeah, this is another one where you have a high response rate. It's about others finding you sexy. It's not about yourself. And the other thing is like when an AGP is engaged in this behavior, like it is very obsessive. It's happening all the time. It's the primary masturbation fantasy. It's the primary thing. It forms a sort of like very like obsessive sort of thing. It's not just like, oh, like I was, getting ready for a date and I was like imagining like getting ready for a date and like, I thought I looked hot. So maybe I got aroused because I was thinking about, I'm going to have sex later with this hot guy. Like that is not the same thing as autogynephilia. Like autogynephilia is a very specific thought pattern that like this questionnaire just doesn't really get at the same thing. And like even in the article itself, it says it is possible that autogynephilia is manifested differently in men and women. Um, and furthermore, it is possible that some respondents in the present study were aroused by the possibility of or fantasy about a sexual encounter rather than the autogynephilic stimuli described. That is exactly what's going on. They are aroused by the fantasy of a sexual encounter, not the mere fact of the like the sexuality itself. Because, for example, this like shaving legs one, they're getting aroused by shaving in preparation for a romantic evening. But the AGP, it doesn't matter whether they're preparing for a romantic evening. Just the mere act of doing it is what triggers the arousal. But if you are a female and you're just getting ready for work and you're shaving your legs or applying makeup, you're not getting aroused. Whereas the AGP, it doesn't matter whether they're, having a romantic date. It's just that triggers the arousal even in everyday context. So this is why this like uh, survey does not challenge the notion of autogynephilia, and it doesn't show that natal females are autogynephilic because it doesn't separate the preparation or the fantasy of a real encounter, a real romantic encounter, which is not what AGP is about. So this idea that 93% of cis women are also autogynephilic, no, that's not what's happening here. And the other thing is like paraphilic sexuality is more common in males than females. Like that is just like a fact. Paraphilic fetishization and sexuality is more common in males. So this idea that it's like the same thing, like, oh, male and female, it's like the exact same thing. No, it's not. It's not the same thing. So even if we give this theory the benefit of every possible doubt and take every single claim Blanchard makes at face value without any critical thought, what we know about how kink and fetish works still tells us that this fetish would still be satisfying a completely non-sexual need. That's why nobody except transphobic people takes autogynephilia seriously anymore. It just literally does not work. Yes, it does. It still works. Okay, so at the very most fundamental level, asking if it's just a fetish, right, is asking the completely and totally wrong question. It could be a fetish, it could be something more, it could be both. The most obvious, the most important question is, what need is this fetish meeting? The fetish is never about sex in and of itself. And then their proof for this is like there's this trans woman who wrote this bimbofication sissy art, this like Samus video game character like turns into a bimbo. And it's about a bimbofication kink. And they're saying like, oh, like, this has nothing to do with like, they say, this bimbo thing has nothing to do with like sexuality. Like, wait, where does it say it? Like, I don't know. They say that somewhere, which is crazy. This is clearly like an expression of an AGP fetish, of a sissy fetish. Like, and um, the trans woman was terrified that she was objectifying women. The kink seemed so misogynistic. Later, she said she started transitioning. So yeah, I mean that's just more proof that like AGP is the cause of why so many trans women transition. Like it has its origins in like kink. I'm not saying that's like wrong. I'm just saying that's just like a fact. This is where it comes from. Okay, and then the other thing is like we sublimate when we feel a need that we believe isn't socially acceptable. And when we sublimate a need, it's always going to try out for the closest, easiest, most socially acceptable outlet. Think of it like a river. It always goes to seek the path of least resistance. I'm going to say it plainly. Being transgender has for a very, very long time been extremely socially unacceptable. Even today, about a third of American society believes that trans people existing is inherently bad. As a result, for the overwhelming majority of trans people in denial, anything is more socially acceptable than being and living as a trans person. So this is, I think, false because what is more socially unacceptable than being a trans woman? Like talking about your kink at work. Like it, if you came to work like in like clothes and like let's say you're like a male, like a regular heterosexual male, and then the next day at work you show up in like a dress and a wig and makeup, and then someone asks like, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you doing that?" And then your answer is like, "Oh, this is just a kink." Like that is going to be far more socially unacceptable than just saying like, "Oh, well, I'm being my true authentic self. I'm really trans. I've been a girl since I was like 5 years old." Like, which narrative is more socially unacceptable? The kink narrative is more socially unacceptable, which is why AGP is like so widely despised in trans circles because it is more socially uh, unacceptable to transition and acknowledge that sexuality is at the origins of your desires for transition versus just saying like, oh, like I was born in the wrong body. I've always been a girl. I have the gender identity. Like this is my true authentic self. Like the true authentic self narrative is like way more socially acceptable than the it's just a kink. Um, so, uh, and we say we know she was sublimating her gender into this kink, which she lost all interest in once she began her transition. Well, the transition itself is a indulgence in the kink. Um, like, of course, you're not going to be interested in like drawing your art because your own life becomes the art. Your own life becomes the kink itself. And if you go back to the gender dysphoria Bible, it does say that um let's see yeah, it says that when you start transitioning, this feeling is really common early on, but it tends to fade as your transition progresses. Yeah, so this is the claim is that, well, once you start your transition, like your sexual arousal goes away. Why? Well, because you often start taking hormones, which kills your libido, which kills your testosterone, and that obviously diminishes your arousal because your whole entire libido. And they're saying, well, I'm still interested in this, so therefore it must not be sexual. Well, the claim isn't that like AGP is about being aroused 24/7, 100% of the time. It's about what is the etiological origins, what is the causal origins. And the other thing is that the erotic aspect kind of gets turned into a romantic ideation. It gets turned into a romantic thing, such that the original impetus of a sort of erotic arousal having being the causal origins of all this, it sort of gets turned into a sort of romantic image of yourself. You no longer get explicitly aroused by the thought of yourself as a woman, but you get sort of like a romantic attachment to that idea of yourself, and it's that romantic attachment that perpetuates the idea itself. So it doesn't have to be so the mere fact that when you start hormones and you start your transition that it sort of like removes the explicit arousal component, that doesn't like disprove the theory of autogynephilia, because the basic theory is that for the trans women who are not exclusively attracted to men, it has its roots in the erotic. But just because something has its roots in the erotic, that doesn't mean every subsequent manifestation of that phenomenon is explicitly connected to having a boner. Like that's just like not how it is. So indulging a kink is vastly safer and more private than coming out and transitioning. Um, so, yeah, well, n- this is the thing. Like, they're saying that being trans is more socially unacceptable. And so it's because they're really trans, they're really gender dysphoric, they really have this inner gender identity. and it is the, you know, and it's just being expressed via kink because being kink is the safer option. Well, the fact that it's private is the key, because like you're not going to transition and then go to work and talk about how it's just a kink, because acknowledging that it has its roots in kink is more controversial, more socially unacceptable than saying that, oh, I'm being my true authentic self, because this is why you keep your kink private. You keep your kink private because acknowledging it has its roots in kink is more socially unacceptable than saying it's because I have a true gender identity and I'm being true to my authentic self. Um, and it is that, like, socially unacceptability of the kink narrative of the AGP. Like, this is why trans women want to deny and suppress the AGP theory so much, is because it is more socially unacceptable to acknowledge that your true authentic self has its roots in the erotic, which is why you keep it private in the first place. And then you only come out and transition when you sort of adopt the new narrative, which is that all these feelings have their roots in you being a true, authentic woman or whatever. um, Repression is self annihilation. Uh, no, it isn't just a kink. It might be a kink, but there's really no such thing as a kink that's just a kink. All kink exists to meet other needs. I've talked to hundreds of people as they're questioning their gender, and the overwhelming majority of them ask, "It's just a fetish, right?" Um, and then all those people, for how many of them was it just a fetish? Zero. Well, this is the very point that proves the autogynephilic theory, because Ray Blanchard was saying that for the trans women who are not exclusively attracted to men, like, all this transition stuff, all this transsexuality, the desire for hormones, the desire for transition, the desire for surgery, it has its origins in the kink. So saying that for every one of those people, this is the origins of their transition, that proves the theory. This is more evidence in support of the theory. And the idea, well, it's just a fetish. Well, AGP doesn't say that it's just a fetish. It just says that the fetish, the paraphilia, the sexuality is the causal origins. It's the root of the phenomenon. But that doesn't mean that the thing can't go on to subsequently evolve to be more complicated when it takes on the romantic attachment, when you introduce hormones to the equation and that impacts your libido. So the phenomenon can keep evolving and manifesting in different ways, but that doesn't negate the fact that the etiology, the causal origins, have their root in the paraphilia. That is the theory. So this doesn't negate the theory; it supports the theory. Every single person I've talked to who was both wrestling with their gender and the kink question turned out to be trans. Well, this is because of articles like this. If there weren't all these articles out there saying that if you have this kink, you must take on this trans identity, then people would just have the trans, they would just have the kink, and they wouldn't necessarily feel like they need to take on the trans identity. Like, they could just say, I'm a male who has AGP, and and that might still be compatible with wanting to go on hormones and going to transition. But you know saying, oh, well, it's not just a fetish, it's I'm really true trans and I have an authentic gender identity, a true authentic self. Well, you don't need to take on the true authentic self narrative. You can just say, like, hey, like, I'm AGP and this is the causal origins of my gender identity, my gender dysphoria. But it's articles like this and the gender dysphoria Bible and all this stuff that are sort of trying to discredit the AGP theory, when the AGP theory is compatible with the subsequent development of gender dysphoria. Because let's not forget, Ray Blanchard and his theory was using the theory to explain why, um, like why trans women are going on to get their transition stuff. Like, like why are they coming in to get hormones and surgery? Like, and why is there this difference between the trans women who are exclusively attracted to men who don't show this pattern and everyone else? Because they're saying like every single person I've talked to who is both wrestling with their gender, well, there are plenty of trans women who are exclusively attracted to men and have always been exclusively attracted to men. They don't show this pattern, which is what the theory like shows, that there's two different types. Because when you are a trans woman who starts off with the sort of like heterosexuality, it is the inversion of the heterosexuality that leads to the kink phenomenon, and it is that inverted heterosexuality, that kink, the kinkiness aspect, that goes on to subsequently develop the feminine identity, the gender identity, which drives the desire for transition. So nothing in this article like actually discredits the AGP theory. Um, okay, so yeah, that is probably all I want to say about this. It's just like, you know, I, I'm not against AGP's transitioning. I'm not against, like, I do think that transition can be a good clinical intervention at the individual level for AGPs, because I think often these AGP thoughts can just take, they can be very disruptive to your life. They can take over your life. They can become obsessive, and you sort of like can't really socially function very well until you deal with them. But I also want to strongly state that it is fully possible to sort of compartmentalize all this. Like, I'm not saying that's like the best way or the only way. I'm just saying it is possible to compartmentalize. And if you have a full knowledge of what's actually going on, what is the actual origins, and not trying to like obfuscate and not trying to deny the erotic origins of your feelings, it can kind of help you deal with them in a way. Like coming to know the truth of what's actually happening in your psychology, and not sort of like, saying like, oh, the real explanation must be that I have a true authentic self buried deep inside of me or whatever. Like, you can acknowledge that like the erotic is the root foundations of all this stuff, and you can go into to transition. But I also think that like knowing the true origins of the self might help you better assess the question, like might be able to have better informed consent to like help you determine whether transition is really like necessary to deal with all this. Because you might just be able to compartmentalize all this without necessarily taking on the identity of like a woman. You don't have to say like, oh, I'm really a female, I'm really a woman, I really have this true authentic inner gender identity. You can just say like, I'm a male who has this thing called AGP, and that like makes me have these desires and thoughts, and like it's okay. Like it is okay to be AGP. Like, it is okay to have these thoughts and desires, but that doesn't provide proof positive that you're trans. It doesn't provide proof positive. I mean, it doesn't like invalidate your trans identity, because remember, Ray Blanchard thought that there are two types of trans. There's the homosexual type and the AGP type, and he thought they were both equally trans. It's not like being AGP trans is like less valid trans. Like, it's equally valid trans. It has just as much right to call itself trans. But I think understanding where it comes from is, I think, important to developing informed consent. Because if you're going to do informed consent about your transition, like, you ought to know what is the causal origins of like where your thoughts come from. And being in denial and saying like, oh well, it's really like this inner authentic true self, that's the root of everything. And like, it's the no, it is a sexual thing, and it is okay for it to be a sexual thing, but we ought to be aware of the facts. We ought to be aware of what's really going on here, and not just sort of like try and denial this because it doesn't fit in the socially acceptable narrative. We shouldn't be afraid of facing the truth. And the fact that they're saying that literally every single trans feminine person they've ever they've ever talked to acknowledges that they deal with this fetish question shows that that is what's really going on. That is the true origins, and trying to like explain it all away and trying to like, um, deny what's really happening. Like no one believes that. So we ought to come and face the truth that this is what we're dealing with, and that doesn't mean we're going to take away transition. Doesn't mean we're going to like take away your hormones. It just means like you ought to be aware of what's really happening, so you can make better decisions. And knowing that AGP is the true cause of these feelings, like it might help you better integrate AGP into your life as a male, as a man, in a way that doesn't require you to take on this full blown like trans identity, because you can have these thoughts, you can have these desires, and you might decide that like you don't need to transition in order to deal with all this. And also, if you have these thoughts and feelings, if you're going into a relationship with someone, you need to acknowledge this. Like you need to let your partner know that you have these thoughts and feelings. Like this idea of like keeping it all private, keeping it all hidden because we're ashamed of these kinks, like that is what's causing people to get in these relationships and then like cause the relationship to crumble when you come out about this 20 years later, because you are so ashamed and repressed, and then you blow up your marriage, blow up your relationship. Like this is why being honest with all this, like being honest that like the kink is the like origins of all these feelings, like it will help protect people from getting into relationships that and just be more honest. We just need more honesty in this conversation. I feel like people aren't being honest because there's so much shame around it. And so yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye.